Hello, it's Steven Hale here with Nashville Banner Editor-in-Chief Steve Cavendish and my fellow reporter Mikeie Reiland. How you guys doing?
Good. Thanks for having us.
Good. Thanks
Hale. For coming in. So, yesterday, Tennessee executed a man named Anthony Darrell Hines at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution here in Nashville. Full disclosure, I normally would have been reporting on this case, but I haven't been because I worked as an investigator for Darrell Hines' defense team a few years back before coming to the Banner. So Mikeie's been writing about this for us. Steve, you witnessed the execution yesterday morning. We're going to talk about all that. But first, Mikeie, I think I'm right in saying, was this your first time out at Riverbend,
out
of prison?
Never been there before.
Yeah, so kind of tell us, what was your experience like outside yesterday? You were out, outside of the prison in the parking lot, kind of covering it from there and waiting for folks to come out. What was that like?
Yeah. It was a really hot day first. We were in the media tent for most of it. I think from the start, there were a fair amount of TV news people, decent amount of scrutiny on this execution after the aborted execution of Tony Carruthers in May. So I think people were waiting to see whether the witnesses would come out around 10:45 to know that it was a normal execution or that something had gotten messed up again.
Right. It's weird how we all get used these certain rhythms, you become accustomed to them, and then it's like, okay, well, let's see if something different has happened, which of course happened with Tony Carruthers. And you're right. I mean, I saw felt like a lot more national coverage, even of this case, because of that, because it was like, this is the first execution since this big problem that happened during the lethal injection. And you also wrote a lot about the kind of run up to that in the legal back and forth about who was going to take part in this execution, how it was going to be done, which we should get into. But maybe first, we should make sure people kind of know what this case was. So give us a quick summary, and then we can get into all that.
Yeah, absolutely. So in 1985, there was a woman named Catherine Jean Jackson Jenkins. She just started working at a motel in Kingston Springs. She'd been a stay-at-home mother for years before that. She was murdered, and a lot of the evidence pointed to Darrell Hines. In 2020, 35 years, is a really long capital appeals process. The U.S. Court of Appeals granted him a new trial because the initial public defender had not interviewed someone who would have been the prime alternate suspect. And it later emerged that he was friends with the sheriff in Kingston Springs. And they kind of wanted to save him from this interrogation because he was at the motel to meet with his mistress.
And this other guy, and that was the man who had found the body, right? Who had reported it.
Yeah.
Turned out that the reason he was at the hotel was not a pure coincidence. But
right.
It was because he was there with his mistress. Yeah. Yeah,
and then he had an alibi. In I think the year after, 2021, he went up to the U.S. Supreme Court. They reinstated the death sentence. Sonia Sotomayor dissented, I think. And then after the kind of moratorium on lethal injections here in Tennessee, after it came back, he got scheduled to be executed yesterday.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, because when we do these pods, we like to try to get a little bit in the reporting process or behind the scenes. I mean, I can just say, to even more fully disclose, I mean, what I did when I was at my last job before coming here was, Darrell Hines he had maintained his innocence. And an outside legal team actually kind of came on to take his case and just investigate it. So me and some other folks just sent out to kind of try to re-interview witnesses, talk to a lot of people who were around and stuff. And so whether it's people who were at the hotel that night or people who Darrell Hines was picked up by some students from Bowling Green. And they drove him back to Bowling Green. I talked to some of those people. So I'm not hiding the ball here. I didn't solve the case. I don't have some blockbuster piece of information to find. I mean, some of what they said may have been new or interesting to kind of look into, but it's not like there was some.
It was no great revelation.
Right. That at the end that was like, aha, this is what did or didn't happen necessarily. I think what you see in a lot of these cases that are so old is just that the way that they were investigated is not the way we would have done it now, either because the standards are not as high, but also the technology wasn't there, DNA, things like that. But yeah, so that's the case. The one of the things that you wrote a lot about that was happening a lot in the litigation leading up to this was focused on Dr. Mark Fowler, who's the physician who was contracted to take part in these executions for the state and who was at the center of the aborted execution of Tony Carruthers. what was the argument back and forth about him before the execution?
Yeah, so I think there was a case that Hines is a part of, or was a part of, with other prisoners on death row, kind of challenging the current lethal injection protocol. And as part of that case, there was a sworn deposition of Fowler that kind of emerged after the last execution, which some public defenders had just questioned his competency. He doesn't have hospital privileges. He hasn't set a central line in years because of that. And they weren't able to set a central line for the Carruthers execution. And then I think a lot of public defenders, attorneys were just concerned about his qualifications, that people would suffer.
And I know that they were trying to get the state to say whether or not he would participate. And
right.
I think I'm right in remembering the back and forth that they ultimately were not forced to confirm or deny that.
Yeah. So at the trial court, at the Chancery Court, they said that they had to answer, but then that answer was stayed pending Supreme Court review. The Tennessee Supreme Court in December made an amendment that is kind of taking control of a lot of the death penalty litigation. So a lot of stuff has to go directly through them now.
Yeah.
It makes a really odd situation when you have the Supreme Court kind of looking over your shoulder on everything. You could see this in Chancellor Perkins' rulings that he said he would say something and then kind of be like, well,
it's all contingent, right?
This is
like, well,
what I rule here does not matter because the Supreme Court is going to be the one that ultimately decides this.
Yeah, there's no pretense that it's going to end there. Everyone knows it's going to get appealed up and pretty quickly. Okay, so Steve, you were inside, and I want to ask you kind of some of what we know about who was and wasn't in there or whatever from your experience. But also, you've done this a few times now, been a witness to a few of these executions. So, what was that like yesterday? Were there differences? Kind of what was it like once you guys got inside?
I think the biggest difference was I had never been in there when there was a family member of someone being executed. And so there's two viewing rooms, and one is for the family of the victims, and the one is for kind of everybody else.
Right.
And so because by the time of the execution, his lawyers who had been with him were in there. His spiritual advisor eventually came in there, but his son was there.
Was in the witness room with you and the other reporters.
Yeah, and in like the sort of you go through. It feels like a series of locks that you go through, and so we went in and sat in one room for 45 minutes, and then you go and you sit in another room for 30 minutes, and then you're finally escorted to the witness chamber.
Right. And he was with you.
And he was with us, and he was very quiet. After we had been there for a couple of hours, and everybody's just kind of chatting, and I think he felt comfortable around us. We were talking about pretty inconsequential stuff. You would have appreciated this. The debate came up about who was the greatest of all time, LeBron James or Michael Jordan, and he had kind of perked up and entered a little bit of that conversation, and it was just nice to just talk to him as human to human, as opposed to trying to interview somebody.
Right. Yeah, and I know you and I have talked about this before. I've talked to people about this whenever executions come up. Like, that is one of the things that I always sticks with me, is the weird collision of kind of, because like you said, you're in there a few hours, so inevitably you're going to end up saying to someone, so, where you're from, or how you, like, you're just going to start talking. But then, at least in my experience, like every 2 minutes you kind of are reminded that you're in this prison. Like, it's a weird combination of things.
It's a very weird dynamic.
So the actual execution, you witnessed that, came out, there was a press conference like there always is. I guess the first big question is just to ask whether there were any visible or audible or noticeable problems, as compared to the last execution, which they obviously didn't follow through on.
There was some litigation going up to this about the fact that Hines had a few strokes, and that there may have had problems administering different lines into him. In particular, they were talking about his left arm and straightening his left arm or unclenching a fist and so forth.
Because he was paralyzed on his left side now,
Yeah.
I think, right? They said.
Yeah, and so they had to. There was an actual medical evaluation of him the day before his execution to see if they could do this, and then there was it was an opinion of the court that this would be fine for them to straighten out his arm, because what happens is when they strap you down to the gurney, everybody pays attention, I think, to the big straps across your chest and legs that kind of keep you from moving, but also there are kind of flanges that kind of go out, and they essentially, like, kind of, if you ever played any sports, like the pre-wrap that they put on something before you tape up an ankle or
Right.
a wrist or something, they'll use that to kind of secure hands, and then they'll tape. And we could actually we were talking about this ahead of time. Before they opened the curtains, we could hear them taping some stuff down. We could hear them like tearing out strips of the medical tape.
Mm-hmm.
But he was there had been this sort of litigation around could they do this, and I don't know if it was because of that or not. Because usually you can see their hands, and you could see their arms. But in his case, there was a sheet that was pulled up, kind of about to his elbows and kind of mid-chest, below where the straps were holding him down. So we couldn't really see his hands. And Catherine Sweeney, who very good reporter over at WPLN, and she's a health reporter, and has done a lot of, she's done some writing and done a lot of reading about sort of how the body reacts to these drugs and kind of like what are signs of.
Yeah, she's done great work on lethal injection and these executions, and I think you're right. She's brought like the sort of perspective of a health reporter and reporting on the medications, the drugs that are used, and how they affect people. And yeah, it's been great stuff.
Exactly, and she was like looking at his hands the whole time, but we couldn't see them.
Mm-hmm.
They were
Yeah,
they were kind of under this white sheet.
and I guess it's worth saying to people, when you're witnessing one of these, among just trying to record what happens and write down things that you see, you're for instance, if you're looking at his hands, you might be trying to see, like, is he moving? Is this person, do they appear to still be conscious or reacting to something? And yeah, depending on the situation, it can be hard to see that. So those were the complications.
I will say too, like, beyond sort of like the witnesses are there as kind of a pool report for all the other reporters on the outside. So we came out and kind of gave a description of what we saw, and so people could write their stories and have like the appropriate amount of detail
Right.
for this thing. One thing that we didn't talk about kind of at that was I was struck by how incredibly frail Hines looked, and we have talked about this before, sort of kind of the age of people on death row,
Mm-hmm.
and he's been on death row for 40 years. This is you always kind of walk into an execution and you're thinking about the crime and this person and their claims of innocence or their non-claims of innocence, and kind of all these things are swirling around in your head. And I think we have this image of, well, we're putting this person who did this terrible thing to death, and one of the things that you're struck by when you're witnessing these things is how different that person may be from whatever happened 40 years ago. Mm-hmm. This was a frail man with a mostly kind of a close crop or shaved head, big glasses, that looked he was not capable of whatever there was. That doesn't mitigate anything,
Right, but it's just that's where he is now, and it's interesting to hear that. I mean, going back to my interaction with his case, I met Darrell Hines on a couple of occasions just when I had to go out to the prison and talk to him when we were working on the case, and this was before he had these strokes, and he was walking around talking, able to. So yeah, he seems to have really gone downhill in his health, and people may not be surprised to know that, like, that can happen to people in a prison setting because you sort of age faster than you might otherwise.
Yeah, what would happen if you had like 40 years of no exercise and bad nutrition?
Yeah, and little sunlight and all the things.
Yeah.
So my kind of takeaway from the press conference that you guys gave was that things. I mean, obviously he was executed. He was killed. So it was unlike the last one. They did not have to quit the execution in midway through. My takeaway from the press conference was that you guys did kind of hear him, grunting, moaning, choking, coughing, whatever the right description is, but reacting to something before that. But that other than that, it was a more or less. I don't even know how to describe these things. It happened.
You're trying not to use the word successful.
Well, I mean, it was successful in the sense that they executed him. But yeah, like that it didn't necessarily seem to have any of the huge problems that happened last time. But as we always talk about with these things, we don't know what he's experiencing, so it's a little hard to say. But
I think when you witness one of these things, you realize that it's not as simple as somebody going to sleep.
Putting someone to sleep, yeah.
And that it is a violent sort of thing, but it is all happening internally.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned we talked earlier about Darrell Hines' son being in the room with you. What was it? What was that like? Were you sitting close to him? Like what kind of did you observe about him during that process?
He was sitting in the rows behind me, and I could hear him being a little weepy, which perfectly understandable. Mm-hmm. At one point, Hines called out and said, "Is my son here?" And tell him I love him. Mm-hmm. And which was, I thought, touching on Hines' part. But he was very subdued the entire time. And obviously he had gotten to know the lawyers and the spiritual advisor, a woman named Diane Gallagher, who had been praying with Hines up to and through his death. Mm-hmm. She was laying hands upon him throughout the execution, and kind of rubbing his shoulder, kind of rubbing his neck. And even up to the point that he was pronounced dead, and she came in and hugged his son, and
yeah. And so Mikeie, you were there when Steve and all the other witnesses came out, but also with them was the family members of Catherine Jean Jenkins who did speak, which doesn't always happen. Sometimes the victims' family members, if they're there, they decide not to speak or whatever. But so they all gave statements. I think a fair summary of them is that this felt like justice to them. And I think it was Catherine Jean Jenkins' son who sort of spoke to all the discussion about whether Darrell Hines would feel pain or be tortured, and he said he wanted people to remember what had been done to his mother. She was stabbed brutally 13 times and killed. So but what was it like sitting there watching them give those statements? What did you take from them?
Yeah. So a lot of my reporting for this case has been talking to Melissa, the daughter of the victim. I also spoke a little bit to Dennis, who gave that statement that you just said. I think my main takeaway from covering this is that when it comes to capital cases or capital appeals, multiple things can be true. It's 40 years of litigation. If we're going to have the death penalty, then you have to make sure it's the right person. You want public defenders to be zealous advocates. You want them to be turning over every rock, exhausting every possible thing. That is true. And also, I think waiting 40 years for Dennis and Melissa has been hard. Like you said, I think Dennis and to some degree Melissa's issues, they feel like there's not so much public empathy from a certain type of person for what they're going through and for what their mother experienced, and there's more concern about this person who they're pretty sure killed their mother.
And I just in my own work covering this, I love how you put that. All these things are true at once, and the goal that I know we all share is trying to make sure that all those things are represented. I do feel a lot for the victims' families beyond just the obvious reasons, because at a certain point, what was done to their family member is taken as just a fact, but it's not a new fact. And so it can, in news coverage, it can, I think, maybe be minimized.
Right.
Or sort of at the same time, treated in just like a graphic headline or like a kind of horrible image of a crime scene, but I'm sure to family members it feels like that's not representing who my family member was or my mother or what.
Yeah.
And that's got to be just incredibly difficult. And like you said, for decades, they're getting something in the mail that says, hey, there's another court hearing about this, or an execution date is set and then it's moved. I mean, it's got to feel never ending.
Yeah, like you said, I think they feel like their mother's life was subsumed into a much larger narrative or conversation. For Melissa, she was early 20s when this happened. Just found it hard to stick with things. She had to move like 800 miles away just because they're from Fairview. The murder happened in Kingston Springs, right off I-40. It was just kind of always there. She felt like she was kind of always living in the worst moment of her life.
I mean, you and I talked about this, but that hotel, it's not the same like company or brand or whatever, but that building, that hotel is still there. If you're living around here, like, and you would drive past it, you would be on I-40, you would it's unimaginable.
And I think with all of that, the tone from the family, also like Jean's grandson said this is, this day isn't necessarily a cause for celebration that this dude is getting killed. It doesn't necessarily bring closure either. It definitely doesn't bring our mom or grandma back, but it does provide some sense of justice, and like we can close the book, this particular chapter, and like we can finally maybe start to move on from this.
Yeah, certainly on a human level would hope so, and also just practically you would think that it can, because these headlines aren't going to go away. People aren't going to be calling them, even though I'm sure they appreciate that you reached out, and obviously they decided to speak. No doubt you'd rather not be doing that.
Well, and it strikes me that the because of the litigation over how Tennessee executes people, and it's been pretty controversial now for several years. It will always spawn a series, like a flurry of legal filings, sort of up to an execution, maybe even more so than in other cases where this is more settled. That even if over the course of 40 years that this can sort of recede from your mind a little bit, and so that maybe hopefully this family's not thinking about this every day.
Right.
And hopefully this family can get to a more peaceful place with the story. In the run up to an execution, it has to be incredibly traumatic for those families who are having to basically see these parts of the case over and over and over again.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to ask you one more thing about being out there yesterday, and then touch one last base before we get out of here. Darrell Hines' attorneys, they were also there. My understanding, I wasn't there in person, obviously, but my understanding was that after the execution, she was out there, but not part of the press conference. Did you end up talking to her at all afterwards, or here? Did they put out a statement? But
they put out a statement, but they were not. They had left pretty quickly.
Yeah, and it's an interesting thing because the TDOC, the Department of Correction, puts on this press conference, which includes commissioner makes a statement, witnesses speak, victims' families speak. They've not included they have in the past, but more recently haven't been including like the attorney of the person who's executed. And obviously those people can make statements elsewhere, or they can reach out to us, which they do. But it's kind of interesting, the practicality of how they've been handling that, and it's something I'll keep an eye on.
Yeah, it struck me that TDOC's position in kind of like putting together this press conference and kind of how they do it is like, well, we're on the side of the family, and everybody else can do your own thing,
which in fairness makes a certain amount of sense, but it's just so I mean, this topic's not going away. We're all going to be talking about how to cover the next execution, which is scheduled for September 30th, which is the execution date for Krista Pike, who's the only woman on Tennessee's death row. And there's already been a bunch of legal filings about this. Mikeie, you've written about them. I've written about some of them, and we'll be writing more about them. But just to say, there's another one of these coming up very soon.
And I think the interest on this on a national scale, and it has to do with the execution of a woman, will be fairly intense and significantly larger than some of these other executions.
And I mean, we'll obviously be reporting a lot about it, but I mean, women are not often executed. I think Krista Pike, if this execution goes through, would be like the first woman in 200 years or something like that in this state to be executed.
It's interesting. This will be Pike would be number 9, and then there's